A daylight abduction, mistaken identity, unwilling captivation, itinerary unknown, Estolian princess.
2022.
When motor vehicles became popular, the Straya run of Estolia had to decide if it was worthwhile to accommodate them on the island. After much discussion and prayer, they concluded that given the small size of Estolia, the established infrastructure for equestrian transport was sufficient for our modest needs. As air transport became more common, a small airport was constructed to serve the interests of Estolia. By the year 2000, the Estolian airline fleet expanded to include 3 helicopters and 4 private jets. A second airport was constructed on our northern satellite island of Pequeño for the affairs of state that Estolia could not avoid in the modern world. Tier Nen Augustus Zakarion, Capitulo 90.
Zeke wasn't thinking about his surroundings as the carriage left the stable cavern and traveled over the lower palace road towards the temple. Instead, he was trying to figure out the significance of his vision. He had expected this period to be fraught with extraordinary portents regarding his successor. He was not prepared for the sense that it was Rhea whose need was the most acute. Once they arrived at the Amador airport, he helped Kadarin out of the carriage. They were standing on the tarmac next to the carriage horses. At times like this, he was grateful for the influence of deity over his life. Nearly 31 years ago, he and his uncle Theo stood on the tarmac prior to his planned departure. They had argued at the time, over something inconsequential and long forgotten. He shouted something in response to his uncle's measured tones, the ones he used in teaching and ceremonies. Blazer, one of his favorite carriage horses, reacting to his raised voice, struck out with sharp, deadly hooves and kicked Zeke's leg. The agony had felt otherworldly, muted, peculiar. He looked down at the destruction of his leg and wondered how it happened. With bones protruding, his leg looked like it was severed, and the tarmac was drenched in his blood. It was not until the day his son, Darren, was born that he knew beyond a doubt that deity had caused the horse to strike him, guided the hooves to make sure his injury would not leave him crippled for life, but would force him to wait to find the love of his life. Yes, he thought now, he had much to be grateful for. Married to Kadarin for 30 years, he still marveled at how extraordinary she was, how enticing her smile, how enchanting the curve of her cheek, how stirring her low timbred voice every time he heard it.
I thank deity for causing the carriage horse to kick me. I wonder where I would be if I did not receive that incredible guidance. You are everything to me.
He brushed the hair back from her eyes, delighting in the feel of her cheek against his fingertips. She flushed slightly and then embraced him. They would be able to tolerate the separation, but it would not be pleasant.
Hurry home, Ezekiel,
she said softly. She was the only one who regularly called him that, and when she did, it was like an extra layer of love. She stepped back and he reluctantly climbed the steps of the airplane to join the others. Once on board, Zeke closed his eyes for several minutes. Kadarin's final words were liquid fire, flowing through his system. He would ache for her. He was already aching for her. But in her voice, he could hear the words of deity to Zacharias, that they were surrounded and safe within the arms of Estolia. The problems encountered by being separated would be tolerable, if it was something deity asked.
Is there some reason you are coming with us, Uncle Zeke?
Nico leaned back in his seat and regarded his uncle with a good-natured expression.
I believe this is one of those rare confluences of circumstance that will require the presence of the keeper.
He glanced at Max briefly, adding,
Rhea will need spiritual guidance, and you will need to be there to give her advice. You might also find your heart involved in the most unlikely of places.
He leaned back and smiled.
Plus, Max turns 30 a little over a week after you.
He pointed out.
Will you be able to visit Damien?
Nico asked.
I believe I will be able to visit with him as well. He has arranged to travel to stay the night in the city. Visiting him was not, however, the impetus for my journey.
Has it been difficult, Uncle, to advise others on the blessings of marrying on their 30th birthday, while not having had that experience yourself?
Nico asked. Zeke did not answer right away. Not being able to look for his Kaylee prior to his birthday, or for months after, had left him feeling more distance from deity than at any time before or since. His faith was tested, but in the end the spiritual experience had been worth the struggle. He spent nearly every day of his recuperation communing with deity, reaching deep within himself to find the faith necessary to get through his trials.
During my recovery, I had a lot of time on my hands.
He said eventually, aware of the question he was leaving unanswered. Nico would have to figure out for himself the answer to his question.
I studied the capítulos and ensayos. I felt as if the depth of spirituality available to me would never have been realized without that critical time in my life. In fact, once you are keeper, I hope to institute a similar course of study for those who wish to take part in it as a mastery program.
Who will it be for?
Nico asked.
It will be a tertiary level within the temple for those who feel called to learn more, like your cousin Jeremiah. It will be a step above the elders. Those who wish to take on the education of acolytes and elders as their occupation will need to finish the mastery year first. The creation of acolytes was one of the critical developments by Amador towards the end of his tenure as keeper. I believe the mastery year will align with the system of study put in place by our ancestors.
I am sure you will have many men wanting to take part in it. I have never met any man who regrets the year spent studying our history and religion.
Nico said, grinning towards Max.
At least,
Max amended.
not by the end of the acolyte year. Does every class of acolytes have at least one who chooses their own underwear?
Max flushed slightly, clearly remembering the embarrassment he felt when he was the one called out for that infraction.
There is always at least one, but I have never really understood why. It really is quite comfortable.
Zeke said. As keeper, he wore something very much like the acolyte undergarments every day.
Did Amador begin the Elder Year at the same time as the Acolyte Year?
Max asked.
Yes, it was critical in the early years. There were many immigrants to Estolia in those days, and when a man was already married, the studies for acolytes were not appropriate. Even now, we usually have 1 or 2 elders each year who are not Estolian, but who have married one of the daughters of Estolia. They spend a year on the island to learn what they need to know, to help them decide if they wish to accept the faith.
What will the Mastery Year be like?
Max asked.
It will be a year of intense study into the capítulos and ensayos, with some targeted focus that will be decided on an individual basis. The masters will oversee the elders, and elders will continue to oversee the acolytes.
Will the mastery program be required?
Nico asked. Since he would take over from his uncle sometime in the very near future, he would be the one to implement the idea.
Each designate and their leadership team will need to choose to work remotely on their mastery, and anyone else locally in Estolia who wishes to study the religion beyond the Elder Year.
I shall value that contribution.
Nico said. The transition from one keeper to another always had challenges. Zeke had wished for more support from his uncle Theo when he became keeper. He recalled a conversation he had with Theo shortly after Catering gave birth to their first child. They discussed much at the time, but towards the end of the conversation, he asked Theo a question he had wondered about ever since his uncle retired.
Why didn't you remain and help me once I became the keeper?
Theo's answer was ambiguous.
You needed to fly solo, Zeke.
Zeke's thoughts returned to the present. Soon his nephew would take over for him as keeper, but unlike his uncle, he felt a strong compulsion to remain closely involved in the temple and all that went on there.
In her head, strong desire to get her education. Her giddy justification